Windows Phone, the beautiful suicide. Microsoft didn't just fail, they failed with style. Windows Phone 7 arrived in 2010 looking like a digital art gallery. While Apple was obsessed with making buttons look like real-life glass skeuomorphism, Microsoft gave us Metro, flat, bold typography and lifelike tiles that flip to show you data without opening the app. It was genuinely cool, but Microsoft had the strategic consistency of a toddler in a toy store. Every time they released a major update, they essentially told current owners, "Hey, thanks for the money, but your phone can't run the new version. Also, we're deleting your apps." The app gap became a meme. Developers didn't want to build for a platform with no users, and users didn't want a phone with no apps. Microsoft eventually tried to bribe developers to port apps over, but the results were buggy nightmares. By the time they bought Nokia's phone division for $7.2 billion, a move later described as burning money to stay warm, it was over. They launched Windows 10 Mobile as a last-ditch effort, but even Microsoft's own executives were spotted using iPhones. It wasn't just a platform death, it was a slow-motion corporate faceplant that cost billions. BlackBerry 10, the king of denial. BlackBerry once owned 50% of the US smartphone market. They were the Crackberry. You weren't a business person unless you had that tactile, QWERTY keyboard. But when the iPhone launched, BlackBerry leadership laughed. They called it a toy because it didn't have a physical keyboard. By the time they realized the toy was eating their lunch, they panicked and rushed out BlackBerry 10. It was actually a fantastic OS. It had a gesture-based hub that unified all your messages into one swipe. It felt like the future, but it arrived in a graveyard. The launch of the Z10 was plagued by delays, and the marketing was bizarre. They made Alicia Keys their global creative director, which is exactly what a failing tech company does when they have no idea how to talk to humans anymore. Then there was the Playbook tablet, which famously launched without a native email app. Imagine the email king selling a tablet that couldn't check email without being tethered to a phone via Bluetooth. It's like a car company selling a vehicle where the steering wheel is sold separately. By 2016, they gave up and started slapping their logo on generic Android phones, ending an era of clicky buttons forever. Palm webOS, the ghost in the machine. If you've ever swiped up on your iPhone to close an app, you're using the ghost of webOS. Developed by Palm and led by the legendary Matias Duarte, webOS was arguably the most influential OS that almost nobody used. It introduced cards for multitasking and Just Type for universal search. In 2009, the Palm Pre was touted as the iPhone killer. It was sleek, pebble-shaped, and had a sliding keyboard. However, Palm was a hardware company that forgot how to make hardware. The Pre was made of cheap, creaky plastic that felt like it came out of a cereal box. HP eventually bought Palm for $1.2 billion, promising to put webOS on everything from printers to toasters. They launched the touchpad tablet, but in a moment of historic corporate cowardice, HP's CEO cancelled the entire hardware division just 49 days after the tablet launched. It was the tech equivalent of a hit and run. To clear stock, they sold the touchpads for $99, causing a massive frenzy for a dead product. Today, webOS lives on as the software for LG smart TVs. It went from being the future of mobile computing to the thing you use to find Netflix. Firefox OS, the $25 disaster. Mozilla, the people behind the Firefox browser, had a noble goal: create an open-source OS for the next billion users in developing markets. The idea was to build a phone entirely on HTML5. Basically, your phone was just a web browser and every app was just a website. They promised phones for as low as $25. It sounds great on a mission statement, but in reality, it was a laggy, stuttering mess. Because the hardware was so weak, the phone couldn't handle the heavy web code. Using a Firefox OS phone felt like trying to run a marathon through waist-deep molasses. If you tried to open the camera while a text message was coming in, the phone would often just give up and restart. It turned out that people in developing nations didn't want a cheap web phone. They wanted a phone that actually worked, like a used Android. Mozilla eventually pivoted the OS to run on Panasonic TVs before killing it off entirely in 2016. It was a classic case of Silicon Valley's savior complex meeting the harsh reality of hardware physics. Iuntu Touch, the desktop dream. Linux nerds have one dream: convergence, the idea that your phone is also your PC. Canonical, the makers of Ubuntu, tried to make this a reality with Iuntu Touch. They launched a record-breaking Indiegogo campaign for the Ubuntu Edge, a sapphire-screened superphone. They asked for $32 million. They raised $12 million. Even though it was a record, they didn't hit the goal, and the phone was never made. They eventually partnered with small European brands like BQ to release phones, but the OS was a gesture-only nightmare for most people. To do anything on Iuntu Touch, you had to swipe from specific edges. Swipe from the left for apps, right for multitasking, top for settings, bottom for, well, prayer, usually. It was incredibly confusing for average users. Furthermore, because it didn't support Android apps, you were stuck with web apps that were essentially just bookmarks. Canonical eventually realized that building a mobile OS is an expensive black hole, and they stopped funding it in 2017. The project was picked up by the community UB-ports, where it remains a niche hobby for people who want to feel like a hacker while checking their calendar. Symbian, the rotting empire. Before Android, there was Symbian. It was the king. If you had a Nokia in 2005, you were running Symbian. It was powerful, battery efficient, and ran on everything from tiny candy bar phones to the beastly N95. But Symbian was built on ancient code from the 90s. When the iPhone arrived with its smooth touch interface, Symbian looked like a fossil. Nokia tried to touchify it with the 5800 Express Music, but it felt like trying to use a desktop computer with your thumb. You had to double tap icons just to open them. It was infuriating. Nokia's internal structure was a war zone. Different teams were working on different versions of Symbian that didn't talk to each other. By the time they tried to fix it with Symbian 3, the code was so bloated and messy that developers were fleeing in droves. Nokia CEO Stephen Elop famously wrote the burning platform memo, basically telling the world their phones sucked and they were switching to Windows. That memo effectively killed Symbian sales overnight. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom that turned the world's largest phone maker into a cautionary tale for Harvard Business School. Tizen and Bada, Samsung's midlife crisis. Samsung is the biggest Android manufacturer, but they hate being dependent on Google. In a fit of I-can-do-it-myself energy, they created Bada, and later Tizen. Bada was launched in 2010 on the Samsung Wave. It looked exactly like Android but with 90% fewer apps. Samsung eventually merged Bada into Tizen, a project they co-developed with Intel. They launched a few Tizen phones, like the Samsung Z series, in markets like India, hoping to build an ecosystem they controlled entirely. The problem? Google is a jealous god. Every time Samsung moved toward Tizen, Google reminded them who provided the Play Store. Tizen on phones was a security nightmare. Researchers found it had the worst code they'd ever seen, with 40 zero-day vulnerabilities. Samsung eventually realized that people buy Galaxy phones for the Google apps, not for the Samsung-branded Milk Music app. Tizen was quietly demoted to running Samsung smartwatches and refrigerators. Now, even the watches run Google's Wear OS. Tizen's mobile dreams died so your fridge could tell you the weather. Migo, the one that got away. If there's a Snyder cut of mobile operating systems, it's Migo. Born from a marriage between Nokia's Memo and Intel's Moblin, Migo was the chosen one. It only ever appeared on one phone, the legendary Nokia N9. It was stunning. No home button, just a pure swipe-to-home gesture that felt like magic in 2011. Critics loved it. Users loved it. Even the hardware was so iconic that Apple and others copied the unibody design for years. But then, corporate politics happened. Nokia's new CEO had already signed the deal with Microsoft. To protect the Windows Phone launch, Nokia essentially hushed the N9. They released it in limited markets and told the world it was a dead end before it even hit shelves. The engineers were devastated. Most of them quit and formed Jola, creating Selfish OS as a spiritual successor. Selfish is still alive today, but it's a ghost ship mostly used in specialized government contracts or by hardcore Linux fans. Migo was the perfect OS that was murdered by its own parents for an insurance payout that never came.